Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn, and in this video I'll be using some of the dies from the new Beautiful Sentiments Vignettes collection. Spellbinders was kind enough to provide me these dies so that I could create with them and share my makes with you. In this video I'll be focusing on the Petite Floral Potpourri die set, and the name says it all. These are small, delicate, dainty flowers, but if you ever have a die set like this and you want it to make a big impression with them, one easy way to do that is to create backgrounds with them. And in this video, I'll be sharing with you a few different techniques to do just that. This first technique is to use your die cuts and create a collage background panel. And the beauty of creating your own backgrounds is that you can tailor them to whatever size card you want. And in this video, I'll be making 5 different sized cards. This first one is a mini slimline. This is 3.5 by 6, and I've already covered my panel with double-sided adhesive. I always have a roll of this 5-inch double-sided adhesive tape in my stash because it's very, very useful for mini album making, but I find it perfect for techniques like this because you can cover an entire panel and not have to risk having a seam in the center of your panel where you have to butt up 2 strips of tape. So it's really, really fantastic for that. And as you can see off to the side, I have a ton of die cuts of this same flower in 3 different shades of yellow. Now, this die set comes with 10 dies, but that's a little bit misleading because some of the die plates will actually cut out several die cuts. And in this case, one die will actually cut out all 3 sizes of this really pretty flower. And once I stuck all my flowers on, I just poured glitter all over that card front. And wherever I did not have a die cut, there was still adhesive tape exposed, and that just clung on to my glitter. And so it's an easy way to sort of fill in the rest of your card. You could use glitter. You could also use something like gilding flakes. That's another great way to kind of fill in and finish up the background panel. Now, during the course of this card, you'll see me burnish that panel often and wipe away loose glitter from the top of it. And by the time you finish with your panel, you'll essentially have like a shed-free glitter card. It'll be really, really nice and solid, and there won't hardly have any glitter come off of it. So I did trim down my panel. It started as the full 3.5 by 6, but I decided I did want a little bit of my card base showing around the edges, so I trimmed it down ever so slightly, and I'm going to continue to burnish really aggressively and wipe down often. For my sentiment topper, I'm using another Spellbinders die. This one just has 3 nested dies in it. It's just called Nestie, actually. And if it's still available, I'll link to it in the description box below. And it's just a really cute set of frames, really, that you can create toppers with. And I like to stamp first and then die cut. I don't know, for me it's a little bit easier to kind of center and line things up when I do it that way as opposed to the other way around. And I decided that I wanted to create that same glittery effect on my topper. And here I am using 2 strips and having to butt them up, and so there is going to be a potential for there to be a little bit of a seam showing, but I figured this is such a smaller area, and where I stamped Best Wishes, that panel is going to cover most of this, so I don't think if a seam is going to be visible, it's going to be barely noticeable. So I pulled off the paper liner, and I'm going to attach my die cut onto it first and then just sprinkle it with glitter. And even though it looks like you're covering a large area by, filling your entire card panel with glitter, it still uses very little glitter as compared to how much you get in one of these bottles. So I feel like, these glitter bottles will just last me forever. So you can really be generous, and it's actually a good way to use up your stash too. So I'll just go ahead and use some liquid adhesive here because we do have a glitter background. So I want to make sure that that topper sticks very well to the front of my card. Off to the side here, I do have some paper flowers that I made in advance, and later on in this video I'll show you how I shape my flowers. But for these, the larger one, the combination that I felt worked was 2 large and 1 medium. And when I cut the 2 large, I like to have them 1 shade of yellow apart. So 1 dark and 1 mid-tone. And then for the medium-sized flower, which is the topmost, that's the lightest. So you can always play around with the number of die cuts you layer, the size, the color. It's all up to you what looks good to your eye. And here I'm going to create a second one. So this is a US A2 size card. So this is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And again, I'm going to start the exact same way by putting some double-sided adhesive tape using my 5-inch roll of tape. And when you die cut for creating panels like these, when you get to the end of your paper and it's not enough to get a full die cut in, still die cut, because you can always use those partial die cuts on the edge like I've done here. And it really actually is beneficial when you're creating your panels to extend your design beyond the borders of your panel, and that just makes it actually just look a little bit more organic. And here I'm creating an ombre effect with my die cuts. So I'm going from my lightest and largest flower to my mid-tone yellow and mid-size color, and then my smallest and darkest flower at the bottom. And I don't know if you can see it, but I am, quote, blending my die cuts where the largest flower meets with the medium-sized flowers. I actually have a crossover in size and color. So, for example, as I go from large to medium in size, I actually have in my mid-tone yellow color some, just a couple of large flowers. And so that helps make the transition a little bit less immediate, because as you're transitioning in size and color, it's not an exact layer of all one type of flower moving into the next. And so the same as I transition from the middle to the smallest size flower, you can see I have 2, 3 of the mid-size, but in the darkest shade. And so there's a little bit of a crossover between size and color. And I think that just helps with the transition to create that ombre effect. And it just makes it look a little bit more natural instead of it being such an abrupt change. So hopefully that made sense. Here I'm gonna go ahead and finish off my card by creating my sentiment topper and adorning that with my leftover 3D flowers that I created earlier. And I also die cut some leaves, which do come in this die set as well. And so the die set does also come with one die that will cut out 3 flower centers. They're slightly embossed differently on in the centers of the flowers, so you get a little bit of a different look. I die cut it out of glitter, so it's a little bit hard to appreciate the embossing, but if you die cut it out of just a standard cardstock, then you'll see it sort of a different pattern in the center of those circles. And for things like leaves and twigs and just kind of the greenery, I always like to trim off and cut into those sort of do a little bit of pruning, so to speak. And what that does is not only can you get it to be kind of the right length, the right size to tuck and fill in your floral arrangements, but it also makes it less obvious that you're using the same die cut over and over, because you've given it a different shape, a different sort of size. And so I only die cut 2 of those kind of leafy vines, but I cut one of them apart into 3 different pieces, and so it looks totally different. So my next technique is to actually use your dies and create stamps from them. So I just die cut this flower design out of some foam. My foam happens to already have some adhesive, and I peeled off just enough of the liner so that it would stick to my acrylic block. And I'm going to create sort of an ombre all over pattern. Now, if you took your time and really focused, you could probably get this to stamp much more crisply and cleanly, but I wasn't really going for that look. I just wanted to do kind of a quick all over pattern without thinking too hard. And when I do these patterns, I do like to start with my largest stamped image, and then making sure to leave enough space in between to kind of fill in with the smaller ones, but then go back in with my smaller stamps to fill in the gaps. Here I'm going to create an ombre look, but it's going to go from light to dark starting in the center and radiating outwards. And I did just with a pencil trace within the die that I plan to use to create the topper that's going to go on top of this panel, so that I don't have to bother with stamping all the way into the center, but I am making sure to stamp across my pencil line. That way it looks like it probably extends all the way into the center, but it doesn't. And I am gonna add a black matte to my card front, because whenever I work with purple, for whatever reason, black and silver and purple is my go-to combination when I work with purple. So I already have my matte layer down, and I did put a layer of vellum over top my stamped panel, and that helps to kind of tone down the color a little bit. It mutes it so that it doesn't seem as busy. But I always feel like whenever you use vellum, it sort of elevates a card and just makes it just a little bit classier, if that's the right word for it. Maybe that's just me, but I always feel like it's just takes your card to a different level. And so here I'm just creating myself some foam strips. That's how I like to make my own foam strips. I don't buy strips of foam anymore, because now I just use whatever width of double-sided adhesive tape, and that's the piece of foam that I die cut to make my stamps earlier. And it's a lot more cost effective to buy full sheets of foam and then cut them down as you need them. And if you die cut from them, you can always put, like I'm doing here, those leftover pieces in the center. Nobody's going to see that. And it just helps to keep everything level and stable. And for intricate die cuts like this, I do like to use a dotty tape runner, because I find that it's just easier and faster than to go over all of those thin areas with a liquid glue. Sometimes you get a little bit of the dotty tape exposed, and so I did have to use my rubber sort of eraser, gum eraser, in order to lift those and clean out those edges. But there's my finished card using a stamped background. Now, this technique isn't necessarily to create a background, but it's actually the first thing I always think of when I see a die set of flowers that are the same shape but different sizes, and that is to create 3D paper flowers or foam flowers. Now these are so small that I didn't really want to use foam because generally when you apply heat to your foam, it will shrink down the flower a little bit, and these are already so small to start with, so I didn't think that it would be manageable to use foam. But I, as you saw, inked up just a spare scrap piece of white card so that I could get flowers that match exactly the background I just stamped. And I'm gonna go through and sort of ink up those edges a little bit more with the darkest shade of purple ink that I used on my panel, and that way I add just a little bit of more depth of color, a little bit more variation and interest. This is a dye ink, and so as it has time to dry and soak into the paper, it will even out, and so always kind of take a second look at your petals once it's had a chance to dry, and then, you know, add any additional ink as you like, because I didn't want everything to be exactly the same shade. I wanted some darker flowers and some lighter flowers. And I'm gonna do some really simple flower shaping here. I start from the back and I just, you know, roll my ball stylus over it and do some simple cupping. And then I flip it over and I do just a little bit of cupping in the center to bring those petals inwards and upwards. And anytime that I do make 3D flowers, I always experiment a little bit with you know, how to arrange my flowers. So sometimes I've stacked up to, you know, 6 die cuts of 3-4 different sizes to get the look that I want. But in this case, I found that just using one big flower and one small flower looks really nice and clean and simple. Now, when I do attach my petals to each other, I always stagger the petals so that the top petal is always between the 2 petals below it. And so that way it looks a little bit more natural and fuller and a little bit more organic. And so it's convenient that this is a good sort of recipe for this flower, because the one die will cut you both size flower petals. So you can die cut as many times as you need flowers. So to make my card, I'm just gonna, again, start with a solid color matte layer. This isn't an exact, you know, fit in terms of the shade of purple, but it's kind of close. So, and it's a very thin border, so so I thought it would work, and I'm using it on my sentiment here as well. This sentiment comes from the Bless Your Heart vignette die set, and that does come with an outer frame as well, but I thought on this card I just wanted to keep it simple and use the inner portion. And it does have 2 dies to achieve this look. So you get the one die that cuts out the sentiment design into your card, and then a second die to cut out the outline. And I use the outline die to die cut just a white backing plate as well. And that way this card is just very simple, very tone on tone, and it makes sort of these little glitter enamel dots really shine, because they just add that little bit of sparkle and interest to the card. And again, I'm going to use my 3D Collal glue gel to attach these. It's really great because you can see me moving these flowers around quite a bit. And if you have different levels, so my sentiment is propped up on some foam, but some of my flowers are direct on the paper, some are hanging off of that panel, as you can see. So with the 3D Collal gel glue, you can just make as thick of a blob of glue as you need to bring it to the level that you want. So I find it's really convenient to use that as opposed to foam when I place my flowers on my card. So there are the two cards that I made using a stamped background. My final technique and final card will be to create a stencil background from your dies. And I'm going to take this one die and die cut this panel multiple times to create a stencil. Now, of course, you definitely don't want to, die cut into an area that you've already die cut. And you also want to be rotating your die so that it's not so obviously repeated in a pattern. Now, the one die will cut for this flower 2 different sizes. And so I try to rotate and vary how close or how far apart I was die cutting from, my previous edge, just to try to make it a little bit less obvious that there are the 2 flower sizes that are always in the same relative position to each other. So here I'm just using some Distress Oxide ink to ink through my stencil, and I know it's a little bit hard to see because it's all white on white, but my card panel is actually a Slimline card. So this is 3.5 by 8.5, and I would totally recommend that if you know what size card you plan on making, go ahead and make a stencil to fit. So cut out a panel that's maybe 1/2 inch or an inch wider and taller than your panel, and that way you can have one stencil that covers your entire panel that you want to stencil, and you don't have to do what I'm doing where I'm moving my stencil around to kind of fill in the space. Now, if you do end up having to do this, definitely always kind of stencil from the edge that you left off on. So that's to say you don't want to stencil from the outside inwards because you might end up with sort of an odd shape or an odd gap. And that's more important if you don't want to overlap your stenciling. Of course, you could achieve a totally different look if you layered up multiple colors, multiple shades of the same color, and then just almost create a bokeh effect by stenciling right over top of your stencils. So this is a really fast, fun, easy way of creating a background. And again, you can do this technique with other dies that you have in your stash as well. And once you create these tools like your stencil and your foam stamps, they may not last you forever like a real photopolymer stamp would and a real Mylar stencil would, but they'll definitely keep them because you can definitely use them a handful of times, just depending on what you're applying. Because maybe with stencils, if you're using things like embellishment mousse or texture paste, maybe that's a one-off because you can't clean it. But if you're just inking through your stencil, you could probably use that a couple more times before you need to throw it away. So what I like to do is these stencils and the foam stamps that I made, I just store them right along with my die set. And so the next time I go to use these dies, I'll have them there and they're already ready made and I can use them on my next project. This thank you sentiment is actually from an APG die of the month. It's from April 2019. I think it's the Elegant Twist. It's sort of that twist and pop-up mechanism, which is really nice. And this die cut, these word die cuts are kind of my go-to for thank you because I just love the font and the scale and size of the sentiment is really nice too. And it fits like all size cards. It fits beautifully on the Slimline. It fits really well on A2 size cards, which are what I tend to make the most of. But it was a lot of fun to dive into different card sizes, just to illustrate the fact that when you're creating your own backgrounds, you can really make it to fit any card size. And the other little tip that I have here is if you are putting drops onto your project directly and you've already put everything and assembled your card, I like to use the magnets to hold down my card so that it does stay nice and level. Because otherwise it would tend to kind of, flip up a little bit. But having the magnets and adhering it down to my Make Art station just keeps that nice and level as those drops dry. You do have to give it a good few hours at least for it to dry at least enough to kind of set it off to the side so that it can dry completely and hold its shape. So here's a final recap of all of the cards that I made using the Petite Floral Potpourri die set. I do have another couple of videos focusing a little bit more on the Heartfelt Thanks vignette and the Bless Your Heart vignette die sets. This does use the sentiment from Bless Your Heart, and my next card that I'll show here does use the die set from Heartfelt Thanks vignette, but I have a couple of other ideas for how to use those die sets in different ways, and so I'll be focusing on those two die sets in separate videos. And here's my final card using dies as a stencil. Thank you again for joining me, and if you enjoyed this video and the cards that I've made, please do consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video. And if you want, please do also subscribe to my channel. If you hit the notification bell, then you'll get a notification anytime I post a new video to my channel. Thank you again to Spellbinders for providing me these dies. I am having a lot of fun using them, and I'll definitely use them more in future projects. Thank you, and until my next video, happy crafting and have a fantastic day. Bye!